Delta Force released in 1998. It was designed to be a military simulation loosely based on the Delta Force Special Ops unit. By the way, that was a US unit. In the UK here, we have the SAS. I think we also have the Squid Lads, and it's probably some others as well. It was developed by Nova Logic. They've actually been in the military shooter for a while, and more importantly, the military simulation series. The first game was Comanche. It was a series of simulation games later acquired by THQ Nordic, but it was your goal in these games to fly military missions in your Comanche attack helicopters. Throughout the years, plenty of these games came out, from Comanche Maximum Overkill, Comanche Global Challenger, Over the Edge. Okay, there were so many of them. So they were the perfect guys to go from, fighter pilot training to boots on the ground soldiers. When Delta Force came out, though, it was kind of in a world of its own. There had been very few military simulators. Simulators at the time were pretty much based on, flight, which is where Comanche came from. But actually taking it to the ground and being something other than a fast-paced arena shooter was a different direction. The player would assume the role of a Delta Force operator. You'd take the part in various theaters with various military operations, being able to customize your in-game character, and of course, moving through using different weapons, different skills and tactics. Whether you're fighting with M4 carbines, pistols, rocket launchers, or snipers, escorting civilians or prisoner of wars to extraction points. Before each mission, the player is able to choose his or her, because yes, you can be whammon very before its time, Jesus Christ, loadouts. And these were all default loadouts from mission to mission, but all without restriction for customization. It had a very basic, but it was still there, inventory system based on one of 3 slots for your main weapon, your sidearm, and of course extra equipment. May that be grenades, so on and so forth. While this might all seem very normal in this day and age, for 1998, Delta Force was something incredibly special and incredibly new. Not only was it famed for its huge maps and huge battlefields, but also had an online multiplayer of up to 32 players. We are once again going back to pre-millennia. I was not even born by this point. That might sound embarrassing to many of you, and I know my age range on my channel is 25 to 32, so please, I beg you not to bully me in the playground. Yet it was actually fairly well received. I mean, famously known for being the first of its kind in terms of walking simulators, something that we'd come on to become very much accustomed to in this day and age. Anything that is called a simulating shooter, from Armor to Squad to Hell Let Loose, all of them having the tagline of walking simulators at some point in their life. So much walking. Because it kind of did want to do this realistic simulation thing, but because of, the technological issues at the time, and maybe partly down to intention, there wasn't a whole lot within this world. You would be walking for up to 10 minutes before seeing everybody. Grass plains after grass plains with a few buildings scattered around. Then all of a sudden you come into a firefight and you get to handle some of the basic but pretty ahead of its time gunplay. The sounds were on point. The handling was as much as you could get in 1998, but it really felt like you were doing something different to your regular arena shooters that were kind of all the rage at this point in time. Delta Force was basic, but albeit a success. It received very favorable reviews from most aggregators, and of course, its player base. Next Generation wrote, though Delta Force's standalone play is often uninspired, hence the walking around for 3 million hours, the multiplayer is one of the most satisfying gaming experiences available today. It was such a success that it actually began to spawn an entire franchise. One that is even coming out to this day. Yes, this is the evolution of the Delta Force franchise, and it has been completely inspired by the upcoming release of the newest Delta Force game that looks absolutely fantastic, I might add. This could be the next kill of a Battlefield, and it has changed quite somewhat. This franchise never was supposed to be a competition to Battlefield, even though that's what it has become in the modern day. So I thought it would be a good idea to look back, because after the first Delta Force, there's some more to get our hands on. In 1999, Delta Force 2 was released. Once again, you'd be in these vast outdoor environments with combat distances up to several hundred meters, really inspiring for that more larger scale gameplay than what was really around at the time. The game had a huge emphasis on realism, much like the first game, but with more enemies, more simulations, and more weapons. One of the biggest selling points of this franchise is how vulnerable you are to other people. Of course, the AI is AI of 1998, but only 1 or 2 hits would be enough to take you down, much unlike a lot of the first-person shooters at the time, where health packs were around every other corner. Missions consisted of a series of objectives, while navigation points indicated for what the player to do. But you can actually approach most of these missions as you see fit, whether it's eliminating all hostages, rescuing hostages, or destroying vehicles and facilities. You could go a bit quieter with your stealth pistols, or heading in loud run and gun with your carbine M4s once again. This time, though, they introduced a mission editor, which was the start of something pretty special. Mission editors were few and far between at this point in time, and it really gave gamers the opportunity to create their own maps, their own enemies and objectives for other people to test out and play. It was the start of creating a community, which is so important when you're starting a new franchise, to get people really involved in creating rather than just consuming. However, despite its advancements on the first game, most people reviewed it as slightly underwhelming, more along the average. Computer Gaming World criticized the game for abysmal graphics, non-existent sound effects, and a lack of background information on the missions. So, you can tell what kind of game it was going to be. If this day and age, if that was the review, I think most of the answers would just be get good.
In 2002, Delta Force Task Force Dagger came into the world. Yes, I know it sounds a bit like a child being born. And also, what is that task force? Delta Force Task Force. Come on, guys. You should be better at naming at this point in time. However, this was when the series started to take a real turn. It had upgraded its reception somewhat, and this was down to its much better graphics than the first one. It retained all of the gameplay mechanics from the first 2, yet the largest difference is that the player can now control a character from plenty more special operations units. Yes, we're not just talking about Delta Force now. You can do SEAL Team 6, the Green Berets, or the SAS, Royal Britannia. Actually, I don't think I can say Royal Britannia anymore. Oh, that's horrific. I think it is very clear that this was a series that was moving from one to the next, almost succinctly between the years, and you can tell that from the gameplay. There was so much similarities, very minimal changes all in all. Once again, bringing back things like the multiplayer and, of course, that mission editor for people to create their own single-player and multiplayer maps. But the selling point of this franchise is the completely open-ended missions. You can fulfill the specific objectives, but maneuver however you really want. Before each mission, the player is able to customize their weapon loadout, and of course, later replace those weapons with dropped ones by killed characters, or even access weapon caches to re-equip themselves. The game was pretty well versed in terms of content, having over 25 missions, but now things are about to change. You see, the first 2 games were developed by Nova Logic, and they were very successful under their wing. Yet Task Force Dagger, the third title, was actually taken over by Zombie Inc. Now, these guys are absolute veterans of the FPS scene. Starting off with a game like Ice and Fire, moving on to the Spec Ops series, which I'm sure you guys are very, very familiar with. They even developed one of the Tom Clancy Rainbow Six. They did Covert Operations, which was an expansion for Rogue Spear. Not only that, but after completing the Spec Ops series, they went on to do the Blacklight games, which, some of the most intense FPS titles of all time. Despite knowing what they were doing, though, this would be the only game in the series that they developed. They seem to be a development studio that actually jump in and out quite a lot to help boost up a franchise rather than actually take it over themselves. Yet after Task Force Dagger, Urban Warfare was on the horizon. But it was a bit different to the other ones. Because of the success of the Delta Force franchise and how it had really advanced, Urban Warfare was a PlayStation exclusive, developed by none other than Rebellion. Rebellion are very much known for their Sniper Elite franchise, and I absolutely adore those games. Sniper Elite 4, Sniper Elite 5, some of the best in the title, and they're still going strong to this day. But they actually took over to get the first Delta Force game on consoles. It was released in 2002 on PlayStation, and later in 2010 re-released on PS3 and PSP. The storyline was a bit smaller than the other games, but this was back in the day when releasing a console version was basically releasing the light version of a game. It wasn't like this day and age where it's pretty much parity between PC and consoles because of the similarities in power and storage. Back in PlayStation 1 days, there was only 12 missions in the Delta Force game. Not only this, but there were much more linear stories, focusing on bank robberies, hostage rescues, and not having the freedom of huge open worlds because of the technology and the platform they were developing on. It meant that they were having to focus way more on story, with fully animated cutscenes, voice actors, all that sort of stuff.
way less vast than the other titles. However, having this different gameplay style meant that the scripted and linear environments offered something a little bit different. It wasn't reviewed all that well because it kind of went a different way, not to mention the fact that, okay, no one really played it, let's be honest. Do you remember that Ridley Scott film? Yes, Black Hawk Down. It was a fantastic movie about guys who are fighting in a helicopter. I think that's the best summary you've ever heard of a title like this, by the way. The US task force were on a peacekeeping operation in Somalia, and this is what the next Delta Force game was based on. In March of 2003, Delta Force Black Hawk Down was released. Once again developed by Nova Logic, it came out back to PC, but also in parity on PlayStation 2 and Xbox. The series had got to the point where they were able to do full releases on all platforms at this point. Black Hawk Down, though, was kind of a collaboration between Nova Logic, who started the franchise, Climax Group, who developed it for Xbox, and Rebellion, once again, who came back to put it on PlayStation. These three together made one of the biggest games in the franchise. It was received better than any of the others. It received a Silver Sales Award from the Entertainment and Leisure Software, selling over 100,000 sales in the UK alone. The PC version was pretty well received, despite the Xbox and PS2 having a few more issues. Maxim said, while it would be impossible for the game to mimic the raw emotion and chaos that define this mission-turned-disaster in real life, the graphics are the best we've ever seen on a battlefield. And I think this was what the aim was. Black Hawk Down, the Delta Force variant, differs so much from the earlier installments in the game. While all the other games focused on long-distance outdoor combat, Black Hawk Down focused on the close quarters, urban environments, heavily sculpted missions similar to something more of a Medal of Honor. The players in Black Hawk Down were accompanied by their squad, much like the movie. You could control 3 AI soldiers that you could give simple commands to, like ordering them to fire, hold positions, throw grenades, that sort of thing. And it was the first time that they'd properly done this, or at least successfully within a Delta Force game. Perhaps one of the more successful tie-ins that we've seen. Do you remember when every single movie had a time video game? Well, isn't it a genius thing to have a movie that ties into an already established franchise? A little bit like doing a We Were Soldiers tie into Battlefield Vietnam, that sort of thing. Or a John Wick tie into Hitman. Yet Nova Logic were in a bit of a role. So even the next year, they decided they wanted to get back on board, but kind of in a soft reboot type of way. Delta Force Extreme is technically the 7th title, if we're not talking about some of the console exclusives. But it was actually more of a remake of the first game, with so many of the levels taken from the initial Delta Force, and of course being redesigned for the modern day. I say the modern day, this is still 2005. It had 3 campaigns, Peru, Chad, and Novaya Zemlya. Between the 3 campaigns, though, it had 60 different levels and also the option for co-op. Now, they introduced vehicular combat. Yes, you could drive Jeeps. It was incredible. And whilst not leaning into it too much, it was a nice addition. You see, many of these Delta Force games had been somewhat similar. It felt like at this point, and I think whilst you didn't have online communities in the same way, the fan base was starting to understand the way these titles would go. Open world simulator shooter year after year. Sometimes they do a little spin-off or a console exclusive, but you know what you were paying for. And this is kind of the way that games would be back in the day. You didn't have the huge advertising campaigns that you do in 2024, so any additions and changes will be a surprise when you load up the game. This meant that a lot of game development ended up being kind of a circular motion. The next game would be the first game with a few extra additions. Then the game after that would once again change a few extra things. Huge and groundbreaking additions, reductions, or changes in general would be few and far between. And I think that was what was happening with Delta Force. When Extreme came out, it was very much a game that people had seen before. With having, once again, more mixed reviews, it seemed like the franchise needed to be shaken up. They did in fact release Delta Force Extreme 2 in 2009. However, it was kind of a blip on the map. It didn't really have the same effect as any of the other games, and it was clear that this series had kind of died off. Nova Logic stepped away and it all went quiet. Until recently. Yes, I'm talking about Delta Force Hawk Ops, now published by the TMI studio, an Unreal Engine 5 game. This is probably one of the biggest time jumps in gaming ever. From the last game in around 2009 to now in 2024, we're finally getting the next one in the franchise.
Delta Force Hawk Ops has gained so much hype, and really the reason that I'm making this video. The amount of titles that I've seen of being the battlefield killer in a time that 2042 kind of failed its launch, and whilst it has regained some traction now, this was the game that it was supposed to be. Bringing back the huge worlds that people know and love, with both single and multiplayer game modes. But not just that, Hawk Ops is going to explore things that I don't think any FPS has really done in a big way. 2 time frames. First of all will be in 1993. You'll be boots on the ground as an elite Delta Force operator, recreating, well, the first games. They're actually trying to bring back the old audience as well as completely reiterate what made this game fantastic. The initial missions of these huge maps are going to be completely revamped with 2024 graphics, Unreal Engine, and of course all the buffs and power that comes with that. Having huge battles, vehicular combat, a plethora of guns and factions, and it's going to be absolutely fantastic. But then we skip forward into 2035. You take on the role of an elite member of GTI, the peacekeeping force founded from the former Delta operations. Your mission to deploy to the mysterious region of Asara and investigate illegal activities in the Havoc Corporation. This looks incredible. The fact that you're able to skip through timeframes, and admittedly, I'm assuming the 1993 portion is going to be somewhat limited, really focusing on just reintroducing you to the franchise, kind of giving some nostalgia hits to people that played it back in the day, and then most of the game's probably going to be within the future setting. This is what we've seen from the multiplayer gameplay. It looks absolutely fantastic. Very much future warfare, whether it's playing as a medic and healing people from afar with shooty medic guns, or of course incredibly satisfying gunplay and vehicular warfare. I think they are truly bringing it back in a way that is new and refreshing. I'm so glad that we're getting a reboot of a franchise, but actually in somewhat of a positive way. Everything I've seen looks like we're heading in the right direction, and not to mention it's free to play. Okay, that does mean the inevitable microtransactions, but having a single player option, my God, that's going to be something special.